Hi everyone, welcome back to Grounded Haven Homestead. For today's Pantry Challenge Meals video, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Since we've been having a lot of repeated meals in these last couple of weeks that I've already shown you, and I don't want to show the same thing over and over again, we're going to be doing something different, and I'm going to be showing you 4 desserts and sweet treats that we made to enjoy over the last couple of weeks. The first couple of things I made on the same day, and I made some zucchini muffins and also some almond biscotti. I am first going to start with the biscotti dough, and in my stand mixer I'm going to add 3/4 of a cup of white sugar along with 4 tablespoons of butter that I'm cutting into smaller pieces. My stand mixer bowl has some leftover brown sugar in it because I was making brown sugar right before this, but it'll be perfectly fine since I'm mixing sugar in this anyway, so I don't need to rinse it out. And then I'm going to cream the butter with the sugar until it's really nice and fluffy. Next, I'm going to add a couple of eggs into this, and also the extracts. I am using half a teaspoon of vanilla extract and then 1 teaspoon of almond extract. I also like to add the salt and the baking powder at this point. It's going to be a half teaspoon of salt and 1 teaspoon of baking powder. I'm going to mix all of that together again in the stand mixer. The last ingredients are going to be 2 cups of flour and half a cup to 1 cup of almonds. Once the dough is all combined, I'm going to turn this out into a baking sheet that I've lined with parchment paper, and this dough is going to be a little bit on the drier side. And then I'm going to split this dough in half and shape each of these halves into kind of like an oval log shape. I'm going to flatten it so that it's about 3/4 of an inch high, and each of the logs should be maybe like 10 inches long and 3 to 4 inches wide. It helps to work with this dough with wet hands, so whenever I feel like the dough is starting to stick to my fingers, I'll just re-wet them, and this helps for the dough not to stick to you while you're working with it. Whenever I am making biscotti, I like to plan to make something else at the same time because biscotti is a cookie that you bake 2 times. You bake it the first time in these kind of like flattened loaf shapes, and then after you let it cool down for 30 minutes, you'll slice it up and bake it again in the finished biscotti shapes. So since I have at least half an hour in between and the oven's already preheated, it's a really great time to just go ahead and make another baked good. Here's what the biscotti looks like before baking, and then I'm going to bake this in the oven at 350 degrees for about 20 to 22 minutes. Meanwhile, I'm going to put together the dough for my zucchini muffins. I'm just using the same stand mixer bowl, and I'm following a new recipe that I will link in the description box, but I did make some modifications. First off, I used brown sugar instead of white sugar, and I used 1.5 cups of sugar instead of 2 cups. And then it also calls for 1 cup of vegetable oil, but I am subbing out half of that oil for half a cup of our homemade unsweetened applesauce. This is going to make it a little bit healthier. I will often take out half of the fat of a recipe and sub it in with applesauce, and it works out really well. And I also doubled the vanilla extract in the recipe from half a teaspoon to 1 teaspoon. I'm going to mix this all in the stand mixer until it started to get a little bit pale and frothy. Next, I'm going to add 1 teaspoon each of baking powder, baking soda, salt, and ground cinnamon. Next, I'm going to add 1 of my bags of shredded zucchini, and I've defrosted this. And you don't have to drain your frozen zucchini when you're adding it into baked goods, because most baked good recipes, unless they specifically say that you should like squeeze out your zucchini, They're formulated to include the moisture and the liquid from the zucchini, so I just leave all of the liquid that has been released as the zucchini has defrosted. Also, when I freeze my shredded zucchini in the summer, I always measure it out so that it's the right amount for either zucchini bread or zucchini muffins, so this makes it really easy for me to use it later on in the winter like I am right now, because it would be really difficult to measure out shredded zucchini once it's already frozen in a block. So by measuring it when it was still fresh, I can make sure I have the exact amount to include in recipes like this. And then I'm also adding the rest of the ingredients, which are the flour, nuts, and dried fruit. For my nuts, I'm using pecans instead of walnuts, and then I'm going to use raisins for my dried fruit, and I'm kind of just eyeballing how much I want of each of those things. That's going to mix one last time just until everything is combined. I'm gonna make sure I don't over mix this, and then the muffin batter will be finished. I'm going to scoop out my batter into my prepared muffin tin that I've put some liners in for easy cleanup. And the batter is a little looser than it would be if you make it fresh, because all of that liquid that was in the zucchini is immediately released, whereas when it's fresh, it's released more when you're baking it rather than beforehand, but it'll still bake up just fine. The muffins are going into the oven to bake, and meanwhile the biscotti have come out of the oven after their first bake. Those are going to cool off for a bit, and after my first batch of muffins are done, I'm going to transfer them to a cooling rack, and this recipe makes enough batter for almost 2 batches of muffins, so I'm gonna go ahead and line my tin again and use up the rest of my batter and bake the second batch of muffins up before I finish up the biscotti. All my muffins have been baked up and have come out of the oven, so I'm going to try them out. They turned out not quite as fluffy as I was expecting, maybe because of some of the healthier substitutions I made, or maybe just the situation with the zucchini having been pre-frozen, but overall I still think that they're really delicious. The flavor is really good, and if you just microwave it for like 15 seconds before you eat it, the muffins soften up really nicely. And because it has vegetables and nuts and fruit, I think that these make for great breakfast muffins without feeling like it's a dessert. Now that the oven is empty again, I can finish off my biscotti, and they have been cooled off so I can slice into them. I'm just going to go in with a knife and go straight down, try not to make any like back and forth sawing motions, and I'm going to slice these into about 1-inch slices. And if you want like a really long biscotti, you can kind of cut it on a bias, but I'm kind of going mostly at 90 degrees so that I have these really cute little ones. After the first bake, the biscotti should be fully cooked but still pretty soft. The second bake is what's going to kind of dry it out a little bit and make it crunchier. Biscotti are definitely meant to be a little bit on like the drier and crumblier side. They're really great to have with tea or coffee, but also the great thing about them having this drier texture is that they last really long. A batch of these you can actually just leave out at room temperature for a month, if not longer. I think they would make for like the ultimate cookie jar cookie because they last so long. So I've transferred the cut biscotti back onto the baking sheet, and this time I'm going to rotate all of the biscotti so that the cut sides are facing up so that they will dry out really nicely. This is going to bake again for 12 to 16 minutes. Like I said, the finished biscotti are going to be a drier cookie, but I do find that the homemade ones are really nice because you can control how far you want to take it. I like it when they still have just a little bit of chew on the inside that I don't find that you get from store-bought biscotti. This has been one of my favorite things to bake recently. It's nice that I can just make a batch or a double batch once a month, and we'll have biscotti to get us through the entire month. We can have them with coffee or just as some little snacks. And because biscotti does have a little bit less butter and sugar than other cookies, they are also a little healthier, which is nice. I find that most cookies are too sweet for me, and if you're like me, then I think that these biscotti will be great to try out because they do have sweetness without being overly sugary. The first two desserts that I started out with are a little bit on the healthier side as far as desserts go. So for the next one, I'm going in the complete opposite direction, and this one is going to be an all-in sweet decadent treat, and I am going to be making some sticky pecan rolls. This recipe is going to have 3 different parts. We're going to need a dough for the rolls, then there's going to be a filling and also a topping. So first off, I'm starting with the dough. The recipe I'm using is from the Pioneer Woman, and she kind of has an order for like how she adds ingredients to mix for the dough, but I don't really follow that. I pretty much just dump all of the dough ingredients into my stand mixer bowl. As long as you know that your instant yeast is active, I never find it necessary to kind of like bloom it in water or milk like a lot of recipes say you do, and then I just let that knead in my stand mixer bowl for about 5 minutes. After that, the dough is going to be a little bit tacky but not sticky, and it's going to look really nice and smooth and silky. I'm going to cover that with a cloth and let that rise for an hour. Meanwhile, I'm going to work on the topping, which has some honey, heavy cream, a stick of butter, vanilla extract, and also brown sugar. I'm going to melt this down on the stovetop until everything is nicely combined and is starting to get kind of glossy. And this is going to make a topping that is kind of like a caramel. It doesn't have to be very thick right now because it's going to thicken up as it bakes. After the butter's melted and everything is combined, I'm going to pour this mixture into my baking dish. I'm using a 9x13 glass Pyrex that I have sprayed with some avocado oil, and I'm just going to pour in all of that filling in there. It looks a little bit like a light caramel or like toffee right now. And then I'm going to sprinkle in 2 cups of chopped pecans. I'm also going to get my filling ready, which is just going to be some brown sugar and ground cinnamon. I'll mix that all up so that it's ready once the dough has risen. It's been an hour and the dough has risen, so I am preparing my working area by dusting some flour on there. And then I'm going to dump out my dough. I'm going to just start working this into a large rectangle shape, and if you've ever made cinnamon rolls, it's a very similar process. A lot of this recipe is the same, it's just the topping is different. So instead of doing like a cream cheese frosting or powdered sugar frosting, we have our sticky topping that we prepared earlier that's in the baking dish. Next, I'm going to add some butter. I'm using melted butter, but if I had just spread some softened butter, that probably would have been better and less messy. So I'll probably do that next time instead of melting my butter. And then I'm spreading out the cinnamon sugar mixture evenly over that. And then I'm going to start rolling it up along the long edge of the dough. I'm making sure not to roll it too tightly. In the past, when I've made cinnamon rolls, I thought that the tighter you roll it, the better. But if you do that, the middle of the rolls end up popping out of the roll as you bake it. So this time I did it a little looser and they baked up a lot nicer. I pinched in the edges of my log, and then I'm going to divide this into 12 pieces. I'm using the really handy floss trick to cut up my buns, and just make sure you have some unflavored dental floss if you want to do that, and then you can kind of like pinch it together and you get these really nice clean cuts. Then I'm going to lay my rolls into my prepared baking dish. The topping is still a little bit soft right now, so you can see those rolls kind of like settling into that topping. And I'll admit at this point, I thought that there was way too much topping. I was worried that it was just going to be too much for the buns. If you know Ree Drummond from the Pioneer Woman, she does not skimp on anything. So I thought that this was going to be just like a crazy amount of topping, but it ended up being okay, so I'm glad about that. So those rolls have to rise one more time for about 45 minutes, and once they're risen, they'll be all nicely puffed up and starting to touch each other, and then I'm going to bake this in the oven. Here are the rolls fresh out of the oven. Rolling them looser definitely helped. I think that they baked up much nicer than when I've made cinnamon rolls in the past. And the topping is actually on the bottom side, so we're gonna have to flip this out. I'm loosening up the edges and then flipping it onto my cutting board. And the topping that we made has thickened up as it's baked, and it makes kind of like this like toffee caramel sticky topping, and we've got those pecans studded in there. It is so delicious. This is my first time ever making this dessert. Our neighbor sometimes makes this for us and brings it over, and I have just fallen completely in love with it, which is so strange because I know I say this all the time, but I am not like a sweets person, but something about this dessert just really gets me. It's so decadent, and I definitely wouldn't make it a habit to eat this all the time because it's very sweet and uses like 2.5 sticks of butter for the entire recipe, but I can't deny it is definitely a delicious special treat. Since this is a dessert that is a little bit more involved, there are more parts to it, and you also make an entire like 9x13 tray at one time. I think it would be a great one to make the entire recipe, but then freeze it in portions, and then you can just take out a couple of rolls every time you want a little bit of a treat, but you don't want to go through the whole process of making these rolls. The last little sweet treat that I'm going to be showing you is a coconut and tapioca dessert soup. This is a Chinese dessert, and in Cantonese it's called sai mai lo. I like to have this soup with sweet potato in it, so that's what we're going to be starting with. I have one of our homegrown sweet potatoes. This one is kind of like on the smaller or medium size, and I'm going to be peeling it and then dicing it up into 1/2-inch cubes. There are other variations of this soup that use taro instead of sweet potato, but I'm not a huge fan of taro, and we also don't grow it, but we do grow sweet potatoes, so that's why I'm using it in this soup today. I'm going to put the sweet potato cubes in my pot where I also have about a cup or 2 of water, and I'm going to be boiling these for about 10 minutes until the sweet potato has started to soften. Next, I'm going to add 1 full can of coconut milk, and since this dessert soup has very few ingredients and coconut milk is one of the main ones, I like to use my nice coconut milk for this recipe. I try and look for the Thai brands instead of the ones that the American grocery store sells. And after I dump in that can of coconut milk, I also fill it back up with just plain water, and I use that water to scrape up any of the coconut milk that's left on the sides of the can, and then I pour that into the pot as well. This is going to dilute the coconut milk a little bit and also help get any of those remnants out of the can. Then I'm going to add a 1/4 cup of sugar, but you can add more if you like it a little bit sweeter later on, and I'm going to let that start heating up again. This is going to be just enough sugar to give the soup a little bit of sweetness, but Chinese dessert soups are usually not very sweet at all. They have just enough for it to be a little bit of a treat, but still be relatively healthy. The last ingredient is going to be these mini tapioca pearls. They are these like really tiny little balls, and once these are cooked, the texture is going to be chewy and soft. If you've ever had bubble tea, these tapioca pearls are made of the same thing. They're just really tiny, and you can find this at Asian grocery stores. I'm going to be using about a 1/2 cup of these, so I'm going to add them into my pot. And when it comes to this step of adding the tapioca pearls, I make sure that I am stirring constantly. They're going to boil in this coconut mixture for about 10 minutes, and I'll make sure that I'm stirring the pot at least every minute or so because they tend to clump together or stick to the bottom of the pot, so I just want to make sure that they are not sticking together. And again, that's going to cook for about 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, you can see how the soup has started to thicken up because those tapioca pearls are starting to cook and thickening up the soup. At this point, they're not going to be fully cooked. You can see when I scoop them up, there's still a little bit of like a white center to them, and you want them to be completely clear all the way through. So I'm just going to put the lid on the pot and let this sit with the heat off for 10 to 15 minutes. Once it's done, the pearls should be completely clear all the way through, no white center in them, and they'll be nicely plumped up, and they have a really nice soft chewiness to them. And the soup should also be thicker at this point as well. If you like it a little thinner, you can add more water. And if your pearls aren't completely cooked, you can just boil them for another 5 minutes and let them sit for another 10 minutes. The finished soup is creamy, very coconutty. It has just a little bit of sweetness. We didn't put too much sugar, but it's enough to sweeten the soup lightly, and the sweet potatoes also add some of their own sweetness as well. It's a great dessert for winter because you can serve it warm, and it's super easy with not a lot of ingredients as well. So that's it for this video, and this is actually going to be the last video for Pantry Challenge 2023. If you've been following along this year, but you're new to the channel and you haven't watched last year's videos, you can go ahead and check those out on our channel. And I'll also put up our cooking playlist on the screen here if you want to see more cooking videos. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in the next video.